in the mid-1920s, Congress started giving the Army a little bit more money to go buy some tanks for development work, only development work, mind. And so the Ordnance Branch engineers went back and they started putting contracts out for some development tanks, mainly with the J. Cunningham Company, who created the T1 Light and this T2 Medium. But the designs were all fairly similar to this, with short, if any, movement suspension, and in fact this thing looks a lot like a British medium tank of the 1920s as well. All was well until some chap called Walter Christie shows up with his M1928, and whereas this would do 25 miles an hour, his 1928 easily broke 40, and it also went a lot faster off-road. Well, this attracted attention. Plus, it also helped that Christie was a little bit of a showman. He took his tank to DC and he demonstrated it in DC to various interested parties of the brass, and Ordnance Branch looked at it and said, you know, we need to get one of these things for testing. Well, originally they were just going to get one, and then Congress said, no, we just funded you for more than one tank, 7 of them at least by the dollar pricing. You need to buy more. But we only need one to test it, to see if it works. Nope, you're going to get a bunch. So the M1931 was developed. So, the M1931, known in infantry service as the Convertible Medium Tank M3, or in cavalry service as the Convertible Combat Car T1. Outside of the difference in the name, the vehicles were pretty much identical. However, at least one, and some sources say all 4, of the convertible combat cars had their armament changed out from the 37mm gun on the infantry tanks, very useful for the infantry support role, to the lighter caliber 50. The difference in the mantlet seems to be that the caliber 50 mantlet was much lighter. Now you will see that this tank is not showing a 37mm gun, it is also showing a caliber 50. And I have some suspicions as to whether or not that is a correct restoration. It is not a full gun, it's just mounted to the outside. And from looking at the mount inside, which doesn't have the locking pins for the caliber 50 that I would expect, I have a suspicion that the mount is for a 37. Unfortunately, if this was actually modified, it was done decades ago, nobody's around anymore who actually remembers the process, and there is a lack of paperwork, at least easy to find paperwork on the matter. So I have now stated my caveat that this shows a caliber 50. There were caliber 50 M1931s, but I don't think this was one of them. With that said, let's move on to the vehicle. Now, the first thing you will note about the Christie-type vehicles is the well-sloped armor. Oh, the Soviets came up with a sloped armor in the T3. No, everybody's known about sloped armor forever. In fact, the sloped armor on this is so pointy, you can use it to bayonet people if you so wished. Armor is about 5/8 of an inch. As you can see, it's sloped both vertically and at an angle. You can get away with that because you only have one crewman in the front hull. So you don't need the extra side spaces. And some other vehicles, like for example Matilda 2, this would actually be turned into stowage bins. Doesn't look it from the outside, they're very heavily armored stowage bins, but if you look at my Matilda video, you'll see that these voids in the pointed front are actually stowage. We also get a wonderful view of the idler wheels, which you can see from the large track blocks have actually become worn to be flat spotted from the repeated hits of the large track links from hitting it. Track tension, of course, just because it can run on wheels doesn't mean you don't need to tension the track when you have it. There are serrated edges here that you loosen up. You are then able to wrench the offset idler into a correct position, tighten it up, and the teeth mesh, and your tension should now hold. Unfortunately, I don't have a manual for the vehicle, so I can't tell you exactly how tense the tension must be. A single loop at the front here for towing. You'll see that the armor is riveted. It looks kind of welded. It's actually very nicely built. Driver's hood opens 2 ways. I'll show you that in a little bit. And then as you come to the side, you start getting to the interesting bits. And so we come to the steering and suspension. This is fairly similar to what we saw on the BT many years ago. And you can see the steering piston comes out here, steering rod I guess, probably a better statement, links through around the road wheel to the hub of the wheel. And you can also see the front suspension arm. So as this wheel moves up and down, you can see this will rotate forwards and backwards, well, more like this actually, so it'll ascribe a little bit of an arc as far forward as this rubber bump stop. So suspension is this way, the steering is here, and that's how you control your vehicle when in wheeled mode. All right, so then as you move back along the side, you'll see that the road wheels are 4 pairs with solid discs for some reason. Sticking at the top here, you can see the pistons for the suspension. So as the big spring suspension, the wheels will move up and down while this is a little bit of room here. Track lengths, 46 per side, and you can see they're alternated between one with a center guide and one without. They're held in place by very simple pins with a little cotter pin holding one end in. The sides are bolted on, which you need to have in order to access the suspension components for maintenance. And then as you come back, well, you're going to see more of the movement for the suspension. There's a locked in place latch here, probably for fuel, but I'll have to have a look a little later. Until you get to the back, another suspension mount, lifting eyes, and then you get to the drivetrain. Okay, so as with the other BTs and T34 even, you'll see that the drive wheel isn't a sprocket wheel in the traditional sense. Instead, there are these rollers which intermesh with the center guides on the track, and it transfers the power that way. It's fine as far as it goes. It's low friction. It's very elegant sort of solution. The problem is that when you get the heavier tanks and sometimes when you need a little bit more traction, it doesn't work out quite so well, which is why toothed sprocket wheels have become the default ever since, and this is just a little aberration. But unlike the BT7 that we saw earlier, which required installing a geared ring or a toothed ring to complete the transfer of power along a transfer case from the back drive wheel hub to the driving road wheel, what we have in this much earlier vehicle, you can see in the middle here, are a bunch of teeth for a chain drive. And you will also note that this wheel, the outer wheel of the drive wheel, is really just a ring. It's not a complete wheel. It's designed to be easily and quickly removed. So there are 4 very large bolts. You undo the 4 large bolts. This outer ring, for lack of a better term, will come off. You can pull off the rollers, install a toothed ring with a chain around the outside so that you can now drive on road power, and install this outer ring again with the big bolts just to make sure that your chain doesn't fall off. And when driving around in road mode, in theory the official top limit was about 45 miles an hour. The testing of the 1928, that cracked 70 miles an hour as I recall, and off-road the whole system would still do on tracks at least 25 to 30. I think in testing it came out to 25. And reasonably comfortably as well. Remember, it's not just about how fast you can travel off-road, but how good is your suspension at dealing with all the bumps. And if there was anything the Christie suspensions were good at, it was dealing with the bumps. It had other limitations, we'll come to those in a bit. But in terms of simply getting the tank from A to B quickly, Christie was very, very good. The road wheel tires, you can see, are solid rubber with little holes cut in them, maybe to add a little bit of flexion with treads, because of course, again, these are on the road, and if you're on wet terrain or whatever, you need to have a little bit of a grip. And the entire weight of the vehicle is propelled only by whatever the contact patches are between this solid rubber tire and the road surface. You can imagine grip could be a bit of an issue. If you look in the back here, you can see one of the large springs for the last road wheel station. Now you'll see that the spring is mounted to a bar which comes to the drive wheel. Now obviously the drive wheel, which is connected to all the mechanics inside, is not on a suspension. It's not going to move. So what this arm does, this is basically a sleeve around the drive axle, which forms the fulcrum of the movement of the road wheel arm. And that's what the suspension component is on this. And you'll also be able to see the cutout in the armor here to allow the range of motion of the axle of the road wheels. When you're at the back of the vehicle, well, the first thing you're going to see are the exhaust pipes for the Liberty L12. It is a V12 of World War I fame. Cranks out in this particular configuration about 450 horsepower, which when you consider that the vehicle only comes in at about 12 ton, that lets you know why it is so fast. Now, that said, this is a 12-ton vehicle, and for a light tank, the Army wanted something closer to 7 or 8 ton, at least at the time. 12 ton was closer to the 15-ton limit of medium tanks because that was the bridging capability that the Army had at the time. This is one of the reasons why the Christie tank didn't actually go very far in Army service in the end. Underneath, you're going to see first the engine, then you come back, there's a large toothed ring, which seems to be the connection point for the starter motor. The starter motor will be about here, runs forward to the toothed ring, which goes around the power shaft. Further back is the transmission. Transmission is a little bit forward and inwards. Power then goes out to the sides through the brakes, and then comes down through transfer cases to the final drive area here. What we have here is an unpowered axle. It's just there to hold the wheels together, basically. Accessing the back is done by way of undoing the 4 bolts here and pulling back. The exhausts are a little bit annoying, which is why we haven't pulled it back all the way to get just that little inset of what it looks like. But if you are willing to scratch the paint a little bit, or back in the day, I guess they didn't care so much, swing it back, it was actually fairly easy to access the components. There's a fair bit of empty space in their mind, so it's not a very efficient use of the armored volume. But again, early tanks, remember this is still basically a late 1920s design, only entered service 1931 with the US. And of course we have a towing swivel mount at the back here. And yet more of the suspension posts. Right, that's it for the back. Fuel, you're looking at 89 gallons, so you're going to go about 2 gallons to the mile when you're on tracks and 2.8 miles to the gallon when you're going on wheels. The engine is actually downrated a little bit, whatever the official rating. The documentation here says 338 horsepower, which will drag the 11.1 ton vehicle along at officially 27 miles an hour on off-road, on tracks, or 45 miles an hour on wheels. As you come around the right hand side, now one thing I will note, and it's on the far side as well, is just how little space you have between the last wheel and the drive wheel. Now, in theory, it shouldn't matter how close they are as long as they don't actually touch, because the way the suspension on this works, it actually pivots just a little bit outward on the way up, so it does clear. However, the reality is that you are going to get rocks and dirt and all sorts of other things get thrown up, maybe attach themselves a little bit to the wheels, and something this close is just asking for trouble. The tracks, when on the travel mode, you can see they come on the top fenders. Now this is a little bit haphazardly placed. It is possible to stretch them out properly so they look a lot neater, but basically they fit there, it's where they go. You can see the adjustable louvers here for cooling. If you think you're about to undertake artillery or air attack, you can close them up. And the normal air intakes are in these long slots here along the sides. And then if you look at the turret, you can see a little pistol port at the back of the turret itself. By the way, the dimensions, 10 inches, 10.1 inches, so almost a perfect square, and the whole system will cross a 7-foot gap. Of interest, These actually come off, and you can see inside the head of the piston that'll come up. So once I clamber up to the top of the vehicle, I'd say one-man turret. It's actually a relatively large one-man turret, all things considered. It's pretty much at the outer limit of where you can put one with the technology at the time, no overhanging turret rings. You can see just how much room is taken off of each side of the vehicle by the suspension system. On the top of the turret, of course, you have the commander's cupola. It's got a flip-open hatch. There's a little swivel port here if you want to stick some signal flags out the top. A good luck seeing them, because your only form of vision are these 4 little vision slits around the outside. But still, a lot of vehicles didn't have cupolas, so that's a step up for the time. Again, it's a simple turret though. It's a cylinder made of rolled steel. The cupola is a cylinder made of rolled steel. Markings. Back in the early 30s, the US Army put some pretty nice markings on the side of the vehicles, made it very, very easy to tell who belonged to what, and also made it easy to tell a T3 tank from a T1 combat car, because the T3 tanks had infantry branch insignia on the side, and the combat car had crossed sabers. When it comes to filler ports, well, the fuel tanks are in the sides, nestled in amongst the suspension units, trying to save and claw back a little bit of that space that was taken up by all the large springs. Coolant and lubrication, I suspect this was an access port for a dipstick. At least I think it is a dipstick that looks like it's coming up. It's been shoved underneath the armor plate where I can't really get at it. And this very well may just be a side effect of a vehicle that has been old and abandoned, and well, who knows what horrors it was subjected to before it finally is able to retire in peace in a nice climate controlled facility where nobody's going to bother it, except for people like me, of course. Right, onwards. It is a heavy and unsprung hatch, and well, it looks like the bar has been frozen and torched off, so they simply separated it. But it would ordinarily just hinge up and back. Instead, I'm just going to leave it down here. And look inside. So first thing I'll see is the division ports have little blocks. If you looks like you're going to start taking too much shrapnel damage even through the small slits, you can block them off. Right, so here I am inside a model 1931. Cool. It's a bit of a wreck, but you can't say many people can say they've been inside an M1931. Alright, so this is, as I say, a one-man turret, and you can see the tooth ring around me. It is a geared hand traverse turret, which is, of course, stock. So, wouldn't be too surprised. Okay, again, we got the 4 vision ports scattered around the sides here. Nothing amazing there. And as I look inside, you should see the mount for what I believe should have been the 37, the short 37. This is not a high velocity gun. In fact, if you look at the pictures, it's almost like it's the same length as the coaxial. You can see that the coaxial is mounted on the right side at a bit of an outward angle to make a bit of room for everything. And I don't see mounting points for the pins for caliber 50, so that's why I think this is the 37, regardless of what is modeled on the outside. So let's see as I go around. So to update from any editing that I may have done, on the right hand side is the stowage for the caliber 30 ammo belt, which back then it looks like you didn't have boxes, you actually hung belts in these silos off of hooks. Okay. On the right hand side we have more, and again they are sufficiently long that we're trying to figure out, are they short 37 belts, because the 37mm round back then was really, really short, or are they actually caliber 50 belts? And it turns out after measuring it, yeah, it's about right for a caliber 50 belt. which now leads to some very interesting discussions as to what I was starting to say at the beginning of this video, as to whether or not this thing had a caliber 50 or a 37mm. Is it possible that this is actually not a combat medium convertible tank T3, but actually a combat car T1? I am going to leave that to the folks at the Center for Military History to figure out, because it's their tank. For the purpose of this video, I am now very confused, and I am telling you that this is what is in this vehicle, and at this point I'm not going to make any further conclusions on the matter. So, enjoy. But anyway, as I'm going to turn the camera forward now, because there is no driver's seat for me to sit in, you're just going to see the pointy nose, and you see the steering wheel. So you remember, oops, there we go. You will remember on the BT video that the steering wheel will be stowed on the side, and you could then apply it for the steering of the vehicle on wheels. There are actually two levers. The other one is just kind of gone. I see two pedals. Let's see, it's one. The steering levers must be the brakes as well then, because there's only two pedals. So I'm going to assume one is a clutch and one is the accelerator. There is a small, if rather destroyed, control panel on the left. The speedometer seems to be one of those ball type speedometers again. And gear shift on the right, and as you can see, it's a 1, 2, 3, 4. Is that gated? Seems to be a 4-speed with reverse. So behind me we can see the Liberty L12. It looks like there would be an actual firewall here, so it's not as bad as all that. Radiators seem to be on the sides. It's kind of tight, but not too bad. So all the empty space is at the back where the transmission is. So yeah, it's not bad in here as a two-man crew. Of course, as a two-man crew, you have all sorts of ridiculous problems in actually functioning. But it's not too tight. But as you can imagine, the Army said, no, we will need a bigger crew. And so the width in here, especially once you take into account the suspension and fuel, just wasn't there for it. As I look around, at the bottom I can see the springs for the front wheels, which again have horizontal springs, not vertical ones like the other three axles. And that seems to be it. I mean, again, this is 1930. This is not a particularly complicated vehicle. I don't see any evidence of a radio mount, and I'd have to look it up to see if there was one. I suspect there wasn't. Radios were a big thing in the Metcalf days, but not every single vehicle had one at the time. So that said, I'm going to get out and I'm going to see if I can get out the front and the slope, which should be very interesting because of the pointy front. Okay, let's see about dismounting the Christie. Okay, I'm stuck. No. The electrical gear isn't helping me. Well, this is kind of dangerous because I'm obviously on a downslope here. But it can be done. So there's always something when we come and do some on-site filming, and we are now thoroughly confused as to exactly what kind of tank this is. Well, we know what kind of tank it is. It's a model 1931. If it's a T1 combat car or a T3 medium is still up in the air, because of the paperwork that was showed said T1 medium. Well, that's actually the derivative of the M1922. The T1 combat car could be this with the caliber 50 and the 37. Now, you'll note that the 37, when you see photos of the 37, it's a short, stubby little barrel. Looks a lot like what is on the mantlet here. And there are photographs of this vehicle with dismantled without anything at all. It's just holes without any projections. So there are people that say that a single vehicle was converted with a caliber 50 and the mantle looks completely different. There are folks that say that, yeah, all the cab vehicles are converted. This particular vehicle seems to have the internal sheeting for the heavy machine gun ammunition, not the 37 millimeter gun, unless perhaps back in the day the 37s came in little belts, canvas belts, and the rounds were only yay long anyway. They look a little bit like the M1931 grenade launchers, grenades. So for now, as I'm recording this, this is a mystery. It seems more likely on the basis of the sheet steel inside, that this was indeed a combat car T1 of cavalry. Doesn't mean to say you're going to send us a Benning now, are you? So the 1931s weren't all that popular with the Army. The Army wanted something a bit bigger. They wanted a wider hull to fit 2 men side by side, one with a whole machine gun, and they wanted a larger turret to fit 2 people. Remember, this is a one-man turret with all the liabilities of a one-man turret. Well, Christie very much had an opinion as to what sort of vehicles he was going to build, and it did not include increases in width and weight. However, it turned out that, unfortunately for Christie, the Army had bought all of Christie's future patents back a couple of years previously, and they basically said, look, if you're not going to build these vehicles, we'll build them ourselves. And so any future Christie-type vehicles that were built, as a T3E2 or the T4 mediums, were not built by Christie. Now, there were a slew of other reasons why the US Army did not go with the Christie-type designs. I have an entire other video if you want to spend half an hour listening to test reports and comparisons with other designs that were out there. It wasn't that the US Army didn't like Christie or they didn't like his design. They gave it a very fair shake and they decided that something better was out there. That said, it wasn't as if these were a complete waste of money for the US Army, particularly the T1 combat cars as used by 7th Cavalry Brigade Mechanized, because these were the only tanks that were remotely fast and remotely modern available to them in those early years when they were developing the new armored doctrines. So to that extent, the Army got their money's worth. Right, thank you very much to the Patreons who helped fund the visit to get out here, or those who bought the merchandise, link below. And of course to the US Army's Ordnance Collection. I'm at the Training Support Facility in Fort Lee, Virginia, for allowing me access to their vehicles. It is not a facility open to the general public, unfortunately. It is designed for training of soldiers, and they just aren't equipped to handle open public days. You never know, maybe something will happen in the future for at least a scheduled open day, but at this time of recording, I'm afraid you pretty much have to be here in Fort Lee on business. All right, hope you found it interesting and informative. Take care. Yeah, the things that are holding the sheet metal roof on? Yeah, that was just installed there to stop everything getting in when it was parked outside for decades. If you see a skeleton in there, just close it up and don't tell anybody.
Hey, Justin. Do you think these racks here, a caliber 50 round, would it go from one end all the way to the other, do you think, or would it be a bit shorter?
Might be a bit shorter. I can bring it. I wish I could bring a dummy around tomorrow, but I moved everything down to Bragg, so it's all down there.
You know, I never did notice before that it's crossed rifles on this thing instead of cross sabers. So that
Oh. Well, that's why it says it's a Convertible Medium T3. If it was cross sabers, it'll be the Combat Car T1.
right.
We can.
But if you look in the hatch here, so it looks like the ammo back then was you kept it in belts, not boxes.
Okay.
So this is your 30 cal stowage here.
Okay.
Okay, that's fair. That actually looks like 50 cal stowage.
Okay. So
Unless the 37 millimeter that they had, the old 37,
Was on a belt.
was on a belt, if nothing else, just for convenience.
Is the overall length of the 37 that
Well,
short though?
the old short 37s, yeah, they were like the grenade launchers, the underslung grenade launchers, the M203.
Okay.
So what I'm trying to figure out is that too long to be a caliber 50 from here to here?
Get a ruler and measure it.
How long is a caliber 50 round?
Let's pull up Wikipedia and find out. It's 12.7 millimeters.
Yeah, well, that that doesn't bloody. This, by the way, is Captain Pham, who's taken a couple of days at the end of his course here in Fort Lee to give me a hand.
Technically speaking, that whole room there is filled with ammo.
The one that says ammo on the front, that's locked and I can't get into. Yeah.
I mean, I can get into it.
Do you have a short 37?
I'm probably somewhere, but I don't know if it's sorted out back there yet.
Yeah.
There's almost any kind of ammo.
I think that's the 37. I think that's too long to be a caliber 50.
Overall is 5.45 inches.
Okay, I don't have my credit card with me. I do have, I think there's a measuring device on my Leatherman, on the suitcase lid there. I think there are inches marked on it. Thank you.
Here, hold something.
Let me see here.
Is this one of ours?
That is one of yours. That's the one that we eventually lost.
D1.
Okay, 1, 2, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so I straighten this out. You say it's 5 inches?
5.45 overall length.
Well, great. That could be a caliber 50 round. It's got like a couple millimeters on each end. Well, what the hell kind of tank is this then?
World War I tank.
No, 1931.
It's time to see for World War I.
Okay, so what you have just seen is a behind the scenes, what the hell have we got? And now I am utterly confused. Okay, it gets better. So the curator here has gone doing a little bit of digging and he has given me a document. And according to this document, it is Tank Medium T1 with gun, caliber 30 and caliber 50. Which means, so whatever it's saying about the mount being not suited for a caliber 50, maybe they mounted them differently back then, or maybe it was a different type of caliber 50 gun. But monetary value back then, $50,845.00. So, okay, now it gets even better.
Couple of access ports, so you would need to unbolt these to hinge down, and then you would access the transmission as well. And you can see the simple drive shaft here. Is it a drive shaft or an axle? I'll be talking on my ass.